Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our second public lecture in this year's Meta-Nexus sponsored conference jointly with the Center for Process Studies. We are in the second of a 3-year series, having resolved all questions about evolution last year. We've decided to settle fundamental physics and its metaphysics this year, its process metaphysics. And then we'll move on to something larger next year. We'll do cosmology. So if you want to know where did the universe and everything come from, stay tuned for next year. It's an awe-inspiring task to be asked to introduce David Ray Griffin. And so when I walked up to him and I said, David, how should I introduce you? He said, well, all you need to do is tell them that I'm widely regarded as a font of truth. And then he had used my computer to check his email earlier today, and I found a fortune cookie, which I presume David had left right there on the keyboard. And as good advice to me for life, it said, go to the elders when you feel a confidence crisis. David Ray Griffin is Professor Emeritus at Claremont School of Theology, where he taught for over 30 years, retiring in 2004. David is one of the founding co-directors of the Center for Process Studies. He's authored or edited over 24 books, including God, Power, and Evil, A Process Theodicy, Unsnarling the World Knot, Consciousness, Freedom, and the Mind-Body Problem, Physics and the Ultimate Significance of Time, I know I've heard that, Religion and Scientific Naturalism, and Re-enchantment Without Supernaturalism. I should mention the Re-enchantment of Science, Postmodern Proposals as well. After retirement, he launched on a new career, one which has sold him more copies since retirement than he sold of all his books during his whole career, probably. And his publications since then include The New Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions About the Bush Administration and 9/11. If you have interest in questions about the Bush Administration and 9/11, David will be happy to talk with you after the talk. And so with no further ado, I'm happy to introduce David to present his paper tonight with the title Whiteheadian Physics, Its Implications for Time, Consciousness, Freedom, and Everything. Well, I couldn't hear. Please welcome David Ricker.
Thank you, Philip. For those of you who didn't get the word, no, I'm not Basil Hiley, nor am I original Cahill. I'm the substitute. When I gave out the instructions for writing the papers for the conference, I suggested that the authors put the things that were more readily intelligible in the body of the text, which they could then present at the public lecture. And then all the complex explanations and qualifications and so on in the footnotes. So if you hear anything tonight that you think is untrue or unpersuasive, just remember it's all in the footnotes. There have been countless discussions of the implications of modern physics, especially quantum physics, for various issues of importance for theology and the philosophy of religion. These issues have included problems involving time, consciousness, and freedom. With regard to time, it has been widely argued that modern physics shows time as we experience it, with its distinctions between the past, the present, and the future, to be ultimately unreal. With regard to consciousness, it is widely thought that any philosophy of mind to be compatible with modern physics must regard conscious experience as a non-efficacious byproduct of the brain's subatomic particles. With regard to freedom, it is widely thought that any understanding of reality based on modern physics must rule out the possibility that our decisions could really involve self-determination. In the light of these supposed implications of modern physics, it is widely assumed that a worldview that takes physics seriously is necessarily a worldview that contravenes the worldviews of the world religions and the biblically based religions in particular. In reality, however, none of those implications follow from physics as such. Rather, in every attempt to derive philosophical and religious implications from physics, the physics is not pure physics in the sense of ideas that have been experimentally verified. Rather, the physics is always physics as interpreted from some particular philosophical perspective. Accordingly, physics as interpreted from a different philosophical perspective might have radically different implications. The point of the present lecture is to show that physics as interpreted in terms of Whitehead's philosophy rejects all three of the so-called implications of physics just mentioned. The basic reason for these radically different conclusions is that Whiteheadian physics replaces the materialistic view of nature, which has been presupposed in conventional discussions of the implications of quantum physics, with a pan-experientialist view. According to the materialist view, the ultimate constituents of nature are devoid of at least 5 characteristics that characterize our own experience: temporality, experience, intrinsic value, internal relations, and even the slightest capacity for self-determination. According to Whitehead's pan-experientialist worldview, the ultimate units of nature are experiential, value-realizing, internally related, partially self-determining events. In the remainder of this lecture, I will explain how Whiteheadian physics leads to conclusions about time, consciousness, and freedom that differ radically from the implications that have been widely but falsely assumed to follow from physics as such. I will begin by explaining why physics, interpreted in terms of the materialistic view of nature, has been thought to support the ultimate unreality of time. In speaking of time, I'm referring to experienced time, which can be characterized in terms of 3 features: asymmetry, constant becoming, and irreversibility in principle. Asymmetry means that the relations of the past to the present is different from the relation of the present to the future. We express this difference by saying that whereas we anticipate the future, we remember the past. The past, we take it for granted, is completely separate. If something happened, nothing we do now can change the fact that it happened. We presuppose, by contrast, the future can still be shaped by our present decisions. Whereas the past is settled actuality, the future involves potentiality to be settled. The present, the now, between the past and the future, is the time in which potentialities are being settled. The statement that time involves constant becoming refers to the fact that this now does not stand still. Rather, it always divides a different set of events into past and future. To say that time is irreversible in principle means that a series of events could not conceivably turn around and go in the opposite direction. Events in my past could not be in my future. Time as we experience it clearly involves symmetry, constant becoming, and irreversibility in principle. However, it has widely been agreed, time characterized by these 3 features is not detected by physics. That's one of those places where there's a complex footnote. It is often said, to be sure, that time is provided by thermodynamics, with its law of entropy, according to which organized systems gradually increase their entropy, that is, become more disordered. The differences in the entropy of successive states means that the order of events, when read off in one direction, will be distinguishable from the order of events when read off in the other direction. The result is a kind of time called anisotropic, which simply means not isotropic, because the direction of measurement makes a difference. However, although thermodynamic entropy is widely said to provide time's arrow, the time in question has virtually nothing in common with experienced time. because it involves no distinction in kind between the past and the future. The order of events as measured by increasing entropy does in fact go from what we call the past to the future, but the order of events, it is said, could in principle go in the opposite direction, so that the entropy would decrease with time. Thermodynamics does not, therefore, provide any categorical distinction between the past and the future. As Kenneth Denbigh puts it, although thermodynamics finds the two directions of time to be distinguishable, it does not display the one direction as being in any sense more real than the reverse direction. If one direction is not more real, moreover, it would seem that it would be possible for things to go in the other direction. Richard Feynman, in fact, wrote that irreversibility is caused by the general accidents of life. Things are reversible only in the sense that going one way is likely, but going the other way is possible, according to the laws of physics. Time in this reversible sense is different in kind from time as we experience it. This point is brought out by Denbigh's statement that mental processes display irreversibility of a kind not shown by physical processes. That is, in the sense that it is not even conceivable that they could ever occur in the reverse temporal sequence. Besides not being characterized by asymmetry and irreversibility, moreover, the time of physics is also devoid of the constant becoming that characterizes time as consciously experienced. Physics, says Paul Davies, has shifted the moving present out from the superstructure of the universe into the minds of human beings where it belongs. As Davies' statement suggests, the failure of physics to detect time as we experience it has led to the conclusion that time in this sense simply does not exist for the entities studied by physics. And since time characterized by asymmetry, constant becoming, and irreversibility in principle is what we mean by time, this conclusion really means that time simply does not exist for the entities studied by physics. But if that is the case, where does time exist? Davies says that it exists in the minds of human beings. But what does that mean? One possible meaning is that ours is a dualistic world, in which time is real for one type of entities, but unreal for the other type. This idea, however, creates at least three serious problems. One problem is how these two types of entities of the world could interact. We know that our minds do interact with the world studied by physics because the molecules constituting the brain both influence and are influenced by our thoughts, feelings, and decisions. But how could things for which time does not exist interact with things for which time is real? The second problem is how things for which time is real could have emerged out of things that are completely timeless. A third problem is that the very idea that time emerged in the evolutionary process is self-contradictory, because the notion of evolution itself presupposes time. More popular than this dualistic view, at least among well-known thinkers, has been the inference that if time does not exist for physics, it does not exist, period. This inference has been expressed in Henry Milberg's book, Time, Causality, and Quantum Theory, in which we read, "It would be either a miracle or an unbelievable coincidence if all the major scientific theories somehow managed to cooperate with each other so as to conceal time's arrow from us. There would be neither a miracle nor an unbelievable coincidence in the concealment of time's arrow from us, only if there were nothing to conceal. That is, if time had no arrow." According to this view, the statement that time exists only in our minds means that it is an illusion. This view was endorsed by Rege's favorite, Einstein, who said famously, "For us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, even if a stubborn one." One of the best-known statements of this position was provided by physicist Louis de Broglie, who said, in space-time, everything which for each of us constitutes the past, the present, and the future is given in block. Each observer, as his time passes, discovers, so to speak, new slices of space-time which appear to him as successive aspects of the material world, though in reality, the ensemble of events constituting space-time exist prior to his knowledge of it. This position has led some interpreters to argue that the Western, biblically based worldview, which regards time and thereby the historical process as ultimately real, is undermined by modern physics. In the Tao of Physics, Friedrich Capra argued that modern physics, with its complete symmetry between past and future, teaches the same lesson as Huayan and Zen Buddhism, which speak of the mutual interfusion of past, present, and future. Essentially, the same message is conveyed by Gary Zukov in the Dancing Wu Li Masters, who, like Capra, quotes de Broglie to support the idea that time is an illusion. This view, that we in the present moment are related to the future and the past in a symmetrical way, has some startling implications. One of these is that we should be able to remember the future. Lewis Carroll expressed this view whimsically by having the White Queen say to Alice, "It is a poor memory that remembers only backwards." Bertrand Russell echoed this idea, evidently without tongue-in-cheek, by saying, "It is a mere accident that we have no memory of the future." Another counterintuitive implication is that the idea of making free decisions through which we bring about a future different from what might have been is an illusion. We should neither be praised nor criticized for our actions. We have all simply done what it has been true from all eternity that we were to do. Given the radically counterintuitive implications of this position, we should hope that the problem of the relation of physics to time has a better solution. And it does. Instead of trying to assimilate experienced time to the limited kind of time provided by physics, we could reinterpret the world of molecules, atoms, and subatomic particles in light of time as we experience it. This reinterpretation could be justified in part by saying that physics, as a discipline, abstracts from the full nature of the entities it studies. This solution was suggested in a 1937 book, Time and Its Importance in Modern Thought by Mary Clue, remarking that a fundamental feature of time as experienced is its irreversibility. She pointed out that the physicist's variable t abstracts from this irreversibility. She then added that although this t is a legitimate abstraction when it is restricted to the purpose of physics, which merely concerns measurement, it becomes a falsifying abstraction when it is taken to be a metaphysical truth about the very nature of time, with which physics has no concern. It was this approach that was taken by Whitehead. The idea that time is unreal for what we call the physical world results from what he called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which involves the error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. The primary example of this fallacy is the idea that the things studied by physicists are vacuous actualities, meaning entities that are fully actual and yet void of subjective experience. It is this idea that leads to the idea that time, besides being undetected by physics, is in fact unreal for the entities studied by physics. If electrons and atoms are simply bits of matter with nothing even remotely analogous to experience, our experience, then they have nothing even remotely analogous to our memory and anticipation, through which we distinguish the present now from the past and the future. Accordingly, for electrons and atoms, there would be nothing remotely analogous to our experience of constant becoming, with its ever-changing now. Also, the only relations that could exist between vacuous actualities are purely external relations, so that interactions between them would involve nothing analogous to our memory, in which our present experience is internally qualified by prior events. There would therefore be nothing to make the succession of events irreversible. But if electrons and atoms consist of experiential, internally related events, then the situation is entirely different. According to Whitehead's pan-experientialism, an enduring individual, such as an electron or an atom, is not a single actual entity enduring through time. It is a temporally ordered society of actual entities. These actual entities are events, called actual occasions. Each actual occasion is an occasion of experience. Each occasion of experience, whether electronic, atomic, or human, begins by prehending prior events, which means taking aspects of them into itself. Each occasion ends with anticipation of causally influencing subsequent events. Accordingly, time's asymmetry, which is based on memory and anticipation, exists for electrons and atoms, as well as for dogs and human beings. Likewise, our experience of constant becoming, in which the present now always divides a different set of events into past and future, would not be completely absent for electrons and atoms. And finally, the fact that past occasion and exerting causal influence on the present occasions are prehended into these occasions, that fact makes the temporal process irreversible. In Whitehead's words, the passage of the cause into the effect is the cumulative character of time. The irreversibility of time depends on this character. Accordingly, just as it is inconceivable that the temporal order of our experience could be reversed, so that past events could be in our future, such reversal is also inconceivable for the entity studied by physics. It is important to realize that physics as such neither affirms nor denies pan-experientialism. In Whitehead's words, in physics there is abstraction. The science ignores what anything is in itself. Its entities are merely considered in respect to their extrinsic reality. It is only when physics, based on this abstraction, is turned into metaphysics, by means of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, that we get the idea that the entities studied by physics are back to its actualities. To commit this fallacy is to ignore the truism stated by Whitehead, that an abstraction is nothing else than the omission of part of the truth. The truth in relation to this issue, Whitehead maintained, is that experience goes all the way down to the ultimate units of which our world is composed. And if that is the case, then so does time. Pan-experientialism implies pan-temporalism. We need not, therefore, waste time on the insoluble problems created by the assumption that time does not exist for the level of nature studied by physics. Turn now to the problem of consciousness, which can be stated as the question of how the existence of our conscious experience is compatible with the world as revealed by the physical sciences. The main presupposition behind this problem, called both the mind-body problem and the problem of consciousness, is the assumption that the body is composed of matter that is insentient, meaning wholly devoid of experience. In a book entitled The Problem of Consciousness, Colin McGinn says that the problem is how the aggregation of millions of individually insentient neurons constituting the brain could generate subjective experience. Given that assumption about our bodily components, there are two possible solutions, materialism and dualism. Philosophers representing these two positions have been working on the problem since Thomas Hobbes and René Descartes, representing materialism and dualism, respectively, since they struggled with it in the 17th century. Contemporary materialists and dualists, however, are no closer to a solution. McGinn, writing from a materialist standpoint, has said that the problem of the rise of consciousness is not merely a problem, rather, it is a mystery which we cannot resolve. Jeffrey Medell, a contemporary dualist, admits that the appearance of consciousness in the course of evolution must appear for the dualist to be an utterly inexplicable emergence. The reason this problem is insoluble in principle, as McGinn points out, has been stated classically by Thomas Nagel, using the French term in soi for being that exists merely in itself, and the term pour soi for one that exists for itself. Nagel wrote, "One cannot derive pour soi from an in soi. This gap is logically unbridgeable. A conscious being cannot be created by combining together in organic form a lot of particles with none but physical properties." Unquote. Some scientists and philosophers have thought otherwise, arguing that the emergence of experience out of non-experiencing entities is simply one more example of the not uncommon phenomenon of emergence, in which the combination of two things, each of which is devoid of a certain property, results in the emergence of something with that property. For example, neither hydrogen nor oxygen has the property of liquidity or solidity. When they are combined into H2O molecules, however, liquidity emerges. And when this water is frozen, solidity emerges. Consciousness, says Searle, is a higher level or emergent property of the brain in the same sense. However, as some of Searle's fellow materialists have pointed out, his analogy is invalid, because the examples are actually different in kind. One way to state this difference is to point out that liquidity and solidity are features of things as they exist for our sensory perception, whereas experience is a feature of things as they exist for themselves. In other words, the emergence of liquidity or solidity is the emergence of a new kind of experienced property. It is hence different in kind from the alleged emergence of an experiencing entity out of entities wholly devoid of experience. The latter kind of alleged emergence of subjects with an inside from mere objects with nothing but outsides hence remains absolutely unique with no analogy. We are left, therefore, with the fact, acknowledged by Nagel, McGinn, and Medell, that if we accept the assumption that the ultimate units of nature are vacuous actualities, wholly devoid of experience, the emergence of conscious experience is inexplicable. The seriousness of this problem is illustrated by McGinn's statement that the transition from insentient matter to things with an inner aspect could be affected only by a supernatural entity. In McGinn's words, only a kind of miracle could produce this from that. It would take a supernatural magician to extract consciousness from matter, even living matter. But McGinn holds that any appeal to a supernatural agent, of course, is unacceptable. Whitehead agreed, rejecting any appeal to a deus ex machina, capable of rising superior to the difficulties of metaphysics. If we agree that an answer to be philosophically and scientifically acceptable must not presuppose supernatural intervention, then there is only one way to dissolve the mind-body problem. We must abolish the idea of vacuous actuality on which both dualism and materialism are based, in favor of pan-experientialism. Pan-experientialism makes the emergence of consciousness conceivable, because what needs to be explained is not the emergence of experience out of non-experiencing entities, but merely the emergence of conscious experience out of non-conscious experience. As that statement implies, Whitehead did not equate consciousness and experience. Rather, he famously said, consciousness presupposes experience and non-experienced consciousness. Most experience is, in fact, not conscious, because consciousness is a very high-level type of experience. The task, therefore, is to explain how conscious experience could have evolved out of subatomic entities that must, by comparison, have only a very low level of experience. Many discussions of this problem, often under the heading of the physics of consciousness, assume that the task of explaining the rise of conscious experience is a task for the physicist as such. These discussions are extremely reductionistic, presupposing that conscious experience somehow emerged directly out of subatomic particles, perhaps as organized into atoms and ordinary molecules. This presupposition is embodied in a program known as hard AI, or artificial intelligence, which holds that there is no reason in principle why computers built out of ordinary molecules could not be conscious. According to Whitehead's pan-experientialism, by contrast, conscious experience presupposes a long evolutionary development, during which many levels of actuality have emerged, paving the way for the emergence of very high-level actualities with the capacity for conscious experience. The notion of various levels of actualities involves a distinction between two different ways in which temporally ordered societies can be spatially ordered. They can, on the one hand, be organized so as to produce an aggregational society, which can neither experience nor act as a whole. Sticks and stones are obvious examples. Although each of a stone's individual molecules, by hypothesis, has experience, the billions of molecular experiences do not give rise to a higher level experience. The stone as such has no experience. On the other hand, various temporally ordered societies can be organized so as to result in the emergence of higher level experiences, thereby producing a compound individual. To say that this compound entity is an individual means that it, in each moment, can experience and act as a unit. From this perspective, even some extremely low-level entities would be compound individuals. For example, electrons, protons, and neutrons would seem to be composed compound individuals arising out of quarks. This notion is fully consistent with quantum physics, according to philosopher William Seeger, who says, quantum wholes are not just the sum of the parts. Higher examples would be atoms, molecules, macromolecules. Still higher level examples would be bacteria and other prokaryotic cells, in which the new level of actuality consists of living occasions. Higher yet would be eukaryotic cells, and then multicellular animals, in which the dominant occasions belong to that temporally ordered society that we call the animal's mind or soul. It is only the experience of these dominant occasions belonging to the mind that sometimes enjoy conscious experience. In this view, consciousness is a type of experience enjoyed by the mind, not the brain. The materialist view, according to which the mind is identical with the brain, renders entirely mysterious our experienced unity of conscious experience. This identist view is reflected in Daniel Dennett's assertion that the human head contains billions of mini-agents and micro-agents with no single boss. And that's all that's going on. But if that is all that's going on in the human head, we cannot explain the unity of conscious experience. As Thomas Nagel says, the unity of consciousness poses a problem for a theory that mental states are states of something as complex as a brain. Dualists, by virtue of saying that the mind is a full-fledged actuality, numerically distinct from the brain, do not have this problem. John Eccles, for example, said that the unity of conscious experience is provided by the self-conscious mind, not by the neural machinery. The dualists, of course, have the insoluble problem of explaining how experience could have emerged out of non-experiencing entities, and how it can influence them in return. Whitehead's pan-experientialism avoids these problems of dualism while being able to say, with dualists, that the unity of our conscious experience reflects the unity of the mind in any moment. The mind in each moment, rather than being somehow identical with the billions of cells constituting the brain, is a higher level occasion of experience that synthesizes data from the brain cells into a unified experience at a higher level. And experientialism, besides allowing for a view of the mind-brain relation that does justice to our experience, can also show how consciousness could have emerged out of non-conscious experiences. As we have seen, there are at least 7 major levels of actuality between the lowest level of nature and the level at which consciousness can emerge. So we can think of subatomic entities, and then subatomic entities such as electrons and protons, and then atoms, molecules, macromolecules, prokaryotic cells, and eukaryotic cells. To understand why these various levels of compound individuals are necessary, we must understand why compound individuals presuppose Whiteheadian and experientialism, according to which actual entities are experiential, internally related events. To return to the mind-brain relation, the brain is composed of billions of brain cells, or neurons, each of which has its own living occasions of experience. The mind is a temporally ordered society of still higher level, dominant occasions of experience. Each dominant occasion arises out of and synthesizes the experiences contributed by these billions of neurons. It is because of the variety, richness, and intensity of the experiences provided by the brain cells that dominant occasions, with the capacity for conscious experience, were able to emerge. The experiences enjoyed by each neuron are quite trivial compared with the experiences of the dominant occasion. However, in comparison with the experiences of quarks, electrons, and atoms, the experience enjoyed by the neurons are extremely rich. The experiences of entities at the level of quarks, electrons, and atoms could not have directly provided the wherewithal for the emergence of conscious occasions of experience. In Whitehead's words, apart from life with a high grade of mentality in individual, apart from life, a high grade of mentality in individual occasions seems to be impossible. Nor could any of the intermediate steps have been skipped. The experiences of atoms, by virtue of synthesizing experiences from their subatomic parts, are richer than the experiences of those parts. As such, they have more to contribute. Likewise, the experiences of macromolecules, by virtue of being internally constituted by their appropriation of experiences from the many ordinary molecules making them up, are far richer than those of the ordinary molecules themselves. They are accordingly able to contribute experiences out of which living cells, dominated by living occasions of experience, can emerge. It is finally only these cells, when organized into brains, that can give birth to the high-level experiences constituting an animal's soul. In Whitehead's words, the whole body is organized so that a general coordination of mentality is finally poured into the successive occasions of the dominant personal society. The body in this process acts as a complex amplifier in which the experiences of the various parts of the body are enhanced en route to the central occasions of experience. The main point of this discussion is that without the assumption that the entities making up our world are events that are internally related to previous events, thereby being partly constituted by them, the idea of progressive evolution, in which more complex, higher level actualities emerge, would be impossible to conceive. Whitehead made this point explicit, saying that the materialistic view of nature, which rules out internal relations, cannot account for evolution. As he put it, an aboriginal stuff or material from which a materialistic philosophy starts is incapable of evolution, Evolution on the materialistic theory is reduced to the role of being another word for the description of changes of the external relations between portions of matter. There is nothing to evolve, because one set of external relations is as good as any other set of external relations. They can be merely changed, purposeless, and unpurposed. One can get an intuitive idea of Whitehead's meaning by trying to imagine how a bunch of billiard balls, even if arranged in a very complex pattern, could give rise to a higher level individual. Only if we understand the actual entities of the world to have experience, and hence internal relations, Whitehead pointed out, then we do justice to the basic idea of the evolutionary worldview, namely, the evolution of complex organisms from antecedent states of less complex organisms. Whitehead's explanation of the evolution of organisms complex enough to enjoy conscious experience involves his notion that every occasion of experience has 3 or 4 phases, the highest of which is not realized in low-grade occasions. All occasions have the first 3 phases, which are the physical phase, in which data from prior actual entities are presented, the conceptual phase, in which possibilities, eternal objects, in the actualities prehended in the physical phase are felt, and an elementary comparative stage in which the data from the first 2 phases are synthesized. In very low-grade occasions, the synthesis results in mere physical purposes, in which the possible forms are not felt as possibilities, but are simply reaffirmed. Each low-grade occasion, terminating with this phase, thereby simply repeats its predecessors for the most part. Electrons, protons, and atoms can hence remain virtually unchanged, century after century. In higher grade occasions, however, the third phase may involve propositional feelings, in which the possibilities are lifted out from the prior occasions in which they were embodied and felt qua possibilities. That phase hence provides the basis for a further phase, in which the propositions are compared with the data from the first phase. It is in relation to these higher comparative phases, called intellectual feelings, that consciousness arises. It is not necessary, for present purposes, that the details of this explanation be understood. You'll probably be glad to hear. It is essential only to understand 2 points. One of these is the idea that consciousness, rather than being synonymous with experience, is a very high-level, rare form of experience, which is evoked into being only in very high-level occasions of experience. Conscious experience involves the capacity to be aware not only of what is, but also of what is not, but might have been. Consciousness, therefore, can arise only in beings capable of entertaining this contrast, which Whitehead calls the affirmation-negation contrast. This is this, not that. When you're aware that something is this, not that, then that's how he defines consciousness. The second essential idea is that Whitehead's division explains how consciousness could have emerged in a purely naturalistic way. A canine or human occasion of experience in which some of the ingredients are illuminated by consciousness is not essentially different from a protonic, atomic, or molecular occasion of experience. It simply actualizes possibilities that, while possible in principle all along, were not really possible until the evolutionary process had brought forth beings with dominant occasions of experience, with sufficient richness of experience to stage the affirmation-negation contrast. Accordingly, given the idea of evolution as involving increasingly complex compound individuals, which can provide their dominant occasions with increasingly complex data, we can get a glimpse of how experiences with consciousness, even self-consciousness, could have arisen through an incremental, very long process out of extremely trivial experiences. The same set of ideas can be used to solve the long-standing problem of how to reconcile science and human freedom. For science-based intellectuals in the modern world, the question of what to say about human freedom has been one of the most difficult problems. Philosopher Thomas Nagel has said, for example, that he changes his mind about the problem of freedom every time he thinks about it. John Searle, spelling out why the problem is so difficult, says, on the one hand, a set of very powerful arguments force us to the conclusion that free will has no place in the universe. On the other hand, a series of powerful arguments based on facts of our own experience inclines us to the conclusion that there must be some freedom of the will because we experience it all along. This philosophical conundrum, as Searle calls it, existed already in the 19th century, which Whitehead called a perplexed century because of a radical inconsistency in the thought of the century's leading intellectuals. A scientific realism based on mechanism is conjoined with an unwavering belief in the world of men and of the higher animals as being composed of self-determining organisms. In that century, it was almost universally assumed that the entities studied by physics interacted in a wholly deterministic way. It was widely assumed, therefore, that unless one was willing to accept dualism, in spite of the insoluble mind-body problem that it creates, one had to accept a completely deterministic understanding of human behavior. Given the unattractiveness of both options, the emergence of quantum physics with this doctrine of indeterminacy was widely hailed as a godsend, because it seemed to provide a scientific basis for affirming human freedom. The dominant position among philosophers, however, is that quantum indeterminacy is irrelevant to this question of human freedom. This position has been based on three arguments. Whitehead's pan-experientialism, however, provides an answer to these three arguments. One argument is that the indeterminacy of which quantum physics speaks is not necessarily ontic. It may be purely epistemic. That is, it may exist only because of the difficulty of measuring what is going on at that level without disturbing the system. What is going on may be in itself fully deterministic, the argument goes. However, the main reason for suspecting the interactions to be fully deterministic is the belief that the entities at that level are devoid of experience, so that nothing analogous to human freedom of choice could possibly exist. But according to Whitehead's pan-experientialism, every actual occasion, after beginning with a physical pole in which prior actualities are prehended, has a mental pole in which possibilities are prehended. Mentality hence signifies at least some slight capacity for self-determination. The second argument against the relevance of quantum indeterminacy is that even if the indeterminacy at the quantum level is ontic, reflecting something that can be called a decision, it must be such a trivial decision that it does not even begin to account for the extremely complex decision-making process involved in Hamlet's question, to be or not to be. A Whiteheadian response to this objection would begin by agreeing that the freedom at the quantum level must indeed be extremely trivial, so that it could not directly account for human freedom. However, by virtue of the way in which the human body, as a compound individual, functions as an amplifier, the trivial freedom that exists at the quantum level can be amplified so as to provide the basis for the kind of freedom enjoyed by the human mind. So although quantum indeterminacy does not provide a sufficient condition for human freedom, it does provide a necessary condition. It is accordingly far from irrelevant. A third argument is that any ontic indeterminacy that exists at the quantum level, far from being amplified within the human body, would be entirely canceled out. I will treat this third argument, which is quite widespread, at greater length. Two philosophers who articulate this argument are John Searle and William Liker. Searle, who says that science allows no place for freedom of the will, says that the fact of quantum indeterminacy does not change this fact. The statistical indeterminacy at the level of particles, he argues, does not show any indeterminacy at the level of objects that matter to us, human bodies, for example. Lycan, seeking to explain why, says that the non-deterministic quantum phenomena cancel each other out, so that at the macro level, determinism still holds as near as matters. Their twofold point is that the indeterminacy that exists at the micro level is canceled out at the macro level in accordance with the law of large numbers. And that this law applies not only to non-living objects such as billiard balls, but also to human beings. Lying behind this conclusion is the materialistic view of nature held by these two philosophers. From that perspective, as we have seen, there is no basis for thinking in terms of compound individuals. This means that all visible objects, whether they be billiard balls, toasters, or human beings, exemplify the same part-whole relation. In each case, the whole is no more than the sum of the parts and their relations to each other. The whole is never a higher level actuality with the power to act as a unit, so it has no power to act back on its parts. From Whitehead's pan-experientialist point of view, by contrast, a billiard ball and a human being are structurally different in kind. Whereas a billiard ball is an aggregational society of billions of molecules, a human being is a compound individual in which the ordinary molecules are within macromolecules, which in turn are within living cells, and these living cells, especially those in the brain, support a mind composed of dominant occasions of experience. Accordingly, although pan-experientialism rules out ontological dualism, it does allow for an organizational duality. This duality is crucial for the question of freedom, because diverse modes of organization, says Whitehead, can produce diverse modes of function. The organization of an inorganic aggregational society, such as a rock, is such that the kind of analysis given by Searle and Lycan is, from Whitehead's perspective, largely accurate. The parts, such as the atoms, molecules, can make spontaneous choices, but these flashes of selection, I'm quoting Whitehead here, if any, are sporadic and ineffective, because there is no dominant member to coordinate. As a result, Whitehead said, these functionings thwart each other and average out so as to produce a negligible total effect. The behavior of a stone is therefore a mere aggregation of effects. As a result, its behavior is describable, even predictable, in terms of the laws of inorganic matter, which are mainly the statistical averages resulting from confused aggregates. It would be a category mistake, however, to assume that this kind of causal analysis is applicable to compound individuals, in which there is a dominant member that can coordinate the various spontaneities in line with its aims in societies of this type, especially human beings. An adequate causal analysis must take into account the final causation, the purposes of the dominant member, which through its dominance guides the person's movements. If we do not accept this distinction between compound individuals and aggregational societies, however, we are led into absurdities. According to the materialist analysis, Whitehead pointed out, a person's bodily actions must be thought to be governed purely by the physical laws which lead a stone to roll down a slope and water to boil. The very idea is ridiculous. Searle, interestingly, agrees that none of us can actually live as if we believe this idea, because, Searle says, we can't act otherwise than on the assumption of freedom. no matter how much we learn about how the world works as a determined physical system. Searle concluded accordingly that he simply had to live with a contradiction between theory and practice. To his credit, Searle adds that this unsatisfactory outcome makes him confident that in our entire philosophical tradition, we are making some fundamental mistake in the whole discussion of the free will problem. Several decades earlier, Whitehead had identified that fundamental mistake as the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which leads to the idea that the fundamental units of nature are vacuous actualities. By replacing this materialist view with pan-experientialism, Whitehead's philosophy shows not only how the indeterminacy discovered by quantum physics can be real, but also how it provides a necessary condition for human freedom. Thank you very much for your patience with this very difficult lecture.
Thank you. We have time for discussion. David, can you handle the question yourself? That'd be great.
See, I told you I wouldn't say anything controversial. Max.
I understand that Hartshorne once said that pan-experientialism, or what he called panpsychism, implies theism. Can you explain the relation?
How'd you know that was a question I didn't come prepared to discuss? Yeah, I mean, it's a very complex issue. I agree with it. In fact, he argues it goes both ways, that theism, properly understood, implies pan-experientialism. Pan-experientialism implies theism. Pan-experientialism, properly understood, implies theism, properly understood. Part of it is simply the different ontology that a lot of what has ruled out theism for a lot of people is just that believing in God doesn't make sense in a materialistic world. And so if you've changed to a world in which the real things are experienced, then the idea that there is some all-inclusive experience in which we live, move, and have our being, that makes sense. So partly it's just a matter of permission and intelligibility. But it's more than that. I don't recall actually right now what all Hartshorne had in mind, so I'll just give my own answer to that. One factor is, and this is more Whiteheadian than Hartshornian, is that if you've got these experiences, you've got spontaneity, and you've got possibilities. So this is very Whiteheadian and not Hartshornian. Then, first of all, there has to be somewhere, if those possibilities are going to be real before they've been actualized in our finite world, someplace for them to be. This is the Platonic problem that Aristotle raised. Where could those forms be? They can't be floating in the void somewhere. And then you've got what I call the I've been away from Israel, so let me just forget the name, but there's a principle that also a lot of philosophers have accepted, and rightly so, which is that things that are not actual cannot act. Whitehead calls this the analogical principle. And I don't know why I can't think of this guy, but anyway, the problem is, even if you could imagine that these Platonic forms or these eternal objects, these possibilities, could somehow exist in void, how could they exert any agency in the world? So, how is it that mathematics is exemplified in the world? Or to move right to our level, how is it that moral norms have any kind of efficacy on us, where they put a little pressure on us to actualize that. So it's a problem of agency. So that would be yet another. You probably remember Max better than I do. Why don't you because Max has this amazing memory, and I have amazingly bad memory. Help me out a little bit, Max. What did you have in mind? If you did, what Hartshorne meant there?
No, that was it. I was trying to. I guess the question was, can one accept pan-experientialism without having to accept theism as a possibility? It can still stay coherent.
It'd certainly be, you'd certainly be better off to be a pan-experientialist without theism than you would be to be either a dualist or a materialist without theism. So I'd call it a good start. And I would say it would probably take quite a bit of argumentation to get somebody to see that they couldn't have a fully coherent view. And it wouldn't be the first item on my agenda to try to convince them that. But if they ask me, sure, then. So, I mean, I developed this in one of my latest books, one called Supernaturalism Without, Re-enchantment Without Supernaturalism. And I originally was writing this book for a series in which they wanted sort of old-fashioned philosophy of religion, in which there would be a chapter on natural theology in the sense of arguments for the existence of God. I don't know that I would have written it if I hadn't accepted that assignment, because it was never a topic that I particularly warmed to. And once I got into it, I found it very interesting. But first I thought, oh, I'll just kind of copy down Hartshorne's arguments. But then when I started looking at them, I thought, well, that's really not a very strong argument. That's not such a strong argument. And so I went back to Whitehead, and I saw that he had a whole bunch of implicit arguments. And he knew what he was doing. I mean, he knew these were implicit arguments. He just didn't spell them out. And so I ended up with about 11 Whiteheadian arguments. And so that would be the way in a long discussion, I would flesh out my answer to that. So some of them are, the distinction actually between a cosmological argument and a metaphysical argument. You've got metaphysical principles; they also need to be somewhere, and so on. And then you've got the aesthetic argument, the moral argument, the logical argument, the argument from mathematics, and so on. Some of them clearly involve pan-experientialism, others don't. They just involve maybe human experience. So I really do believe the worldview only makes sense, fully makes sense in a coherent way with pan-entheism. So let me stop there. Yes.
You said that the actual entities of the world have experience and hence internal relations. Does it work the other way too? That is, if internal relations, then therefore experience?
Well, that's what we've been arguing with Dan. I'll repeat the question. I argued that pan-experientialism implies that everything has internal relations. Anything that has experience is internally constituted by its appropriation of data, experiences from others. You're internally qualified by those. So she's asking, does it go the other way? If something has internal relations, does that mean it necessarily has experience? And where's Dan? Okay, yeah, so we've been debating that quite a bit. And I think a fully intelligible doctrine of internal relations does require experience. But, you know, I'm very happy to have somebody confirm internal relations, even if they don't believe that that requires experience. So I'm not going to try to cram Dan experientialism down Dan's throat. I'm just very happy that he believes in universal interrelatedness. And it's, you know, like the lawyer joke, it's a good start. And so Dan's, you know, 3/4 of the way to the truth. That's good enough for now. He's still a young man. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the paper. A number of us read it out loud to each other during the break, and we thought we did quite well, but you did it even better. So that's wonderful. I have a brother-in-law who's a physicist, and I intend to give him this paper. And I fully expect him to say, you know, Professor Griffin makes his own experience of the world normative for everything else that goes on. And that's problematic, I expect him to say. How would you think I should respond to him?
You should say, oh yeah. Well, there's a large element of truth in that we don't really have a choice. In the sense that if we're going to raise the metaphysical question, what are things in themselves? Not how do they appear to us, not how do they behave, not what kind of point of readings do we get from them, anything. We're going to ask the metaphysical question, what are they in themselves? I don't think we have any choice but to think in terms of analogy with our own experience. There's a long tradition that has affirmed this. It goes back to Berkeley, and because he said a lot of idiotic things, Bishop Berkeley, he's generally dismissed as as an idiot, but he did say some idiotic things. You know, that this podium doesn't really exist as a set of actuality, but it's simply a set of ideas that God is impressing on my mind. So the chapter title I had in my God, Power, and Evil about Berkeley was God makes a sensational impression on us because it affects our sensory. My little try for it. But Berkeley had an insight, and Whitehead picks up this side. And very interestingly, nobody, I think, in the history of had ever thought of Berkeley in the same breath with the Romantics, Wordsworth, so on. But Whitehead does, in the chapter on romantic reactions. And what he says they have in common is the rejection of the notion of vacuous actuality. Because Berkeley said, we only have two choices if you're asking, what does the word to be mean? You know, if we say something is, what does that mean? He says, well, he's one of the first empiricists, so he says, it's got to be rooted in our experience. Unless it's rooted in a direct experience, it's not a meaningful notion. So he says, in our direct experience, we've got two bases, that something can either be a perceiver, and he had a very generous meaning of perceiver. By perceiver, he meant something that perceived but also acted. So it was very similar to an actual entity, a Whiteheadian actual entity. So he said, there can be those kinds of things, and we know what they are, because we're one of them. And by analogy, we think of God as one of them. But then otherwise, all we have are perceived things, this podium. And, but what does it mean to call something a perceived thing? It means that its very essence, the famous saying, esse is pacific. The very essence of it is to be perceived. Well, if its very essence is to be perceived, then it can't exist apart from being perceived. And so that, and then you have the question, you go to the library and there's a book there and you glance at it. And then a year later you go back to the library and there's that same book and there's more dust on it. So your fingerprints from last year are there. You say, now, was this book, did it did it pop out of existence while I was away and nobody else came in here? And then it popped back into existence with a little additional dust on it? No. So, he says, therefore, God was perceiving it all along. So that led Berkeley to be ridiculed. But his argument was a good one. If you accept his premise, then you have to say something. So he was rejecting Descartes. He was saying, Descartes, you told us there are these minds, and there are these bodies that are mere external things, they're just things, and you're saying they're actual, but you can't give us a meaning for it. What does it mean for that thing to exist, other than for it to be perceived? And so, now, the connection with the Romantics then was that Whitehead said Berkeley and the Romantics shared this notion of the rejection of any actualities devoid of intrinsic value. So for Whitehead, this was in Science Among the World. This notion that everything has intrinsic value. This was his new insight as he had moved from philosophy of nature to metaphysics, and then did generalize. So he says, with agreeing with Berkeley, if we're going to ask, not just how do these things behave, and define it the way he did as philosophy of nature, he said, there, by nature, we mean the objects of our sensory perception, something like that. Where that's what things appear to be less. So he says he's going to move to metaphysics and say, okay, what's really going on here? What is this natural world out of which we've emerged? We have no choice but to generalize our own experience down. And then that's the big question. What do you, when you generalize, what do you subtract? Because nobody thinks their dogs have experienced white as complex as their element. Well, certain kinds of dogs, but generally not. And then nobody really thinks, as you go on further, that amoeba, say, have experienced anything close to a dog. So we think, but we generalize the notion of experience. So in that sense, I would agree with your friend who meant it as a hostile question, and I would say, that's just very perceptive on your part. And then point out that, we really don't have a choice but to think by analogy with our own experience if we're going to ask the metaphysical question. Now, a lot of people don't want to ask that question, but if he says, okay, well, Griffin's playing this game called metaphysics, you can't criticize that unless you've got an alternative. How would you do metaphysics some other way? And I don't think it could be done. Yes.
You were talking about consciousness. You can't remember exactly what you said, but something to the effect you couldn't account how consciousness could come from inanimate things, and here it is. Nobody seems, and I've read Searles and Crick and so on, nobody seems to be able to say what consciousness is. They talk about what it does. Now, you can't say what it is and get a hold of it someday. There's another way to go, which I think people ought to do. I never said anything better than you can get at something that I was looking for where it began. Whether the original current of thought is, it develops over a period of time. We are the ultimate results of the development of consciousness. The question is, biologically and evolutionarily, where did it start in the first place? It's a question that ought to be asked. I have an answer for you, but I won't. Anybody asking that question?
Well, first of all, she had said that everybody talks about consciousness, that nobody gives an idea of what it is. I think to some extent that's right. And if we're talking about, just say, experience, you've either got to know what experience is, or, it's like the color yellow in the famous example. If you're colorblind or you're blind entirely, and somebody tells you something is yellow, you can't define yellow. It's a simple thing. You've got to be able to have, experience itself is that way. If there were some entity that didn't have experience, you couldn't explain to it what experience was. So in that sense, it is an indefinable. But Whitehead did give a definition of conscious experience, and that's what I was talking about with the affirmation, negation, contrast. Now, I'm not saying that's the one and only true, right definition of consciousness, but it's the one he was working with. And so when he argued that not all things that are experiential are conscious, he was presupposing that definition, that at a certain level, we now know that bacteria respond to things and they actually have some memory. So if bacteria that have experienced a certain chemical that they don't like, it's very unpleasant to them, they avoid it, whereas you get some bacteria that haven't experienced it before, they'll get closer to it. So there is learning of a sort going on. But I don't think anybody would think, well, I shouldn't say that. I wouldn't think that that I would want to say the bacteria were conscious of that stuff, where they'd be kind of communicating with each other and saying, don't go over there, that's that stuff. That's the green stuff and not the red stuff. The red stuff's good. So that would be conscious. We can do that sort of thing. We can say, this is a red state, not a blue state. So we're conscious of that, for good and for ill. But so it is a kind of definition. Now, your further point about we only understand things by understanding how they came about. Sure, a large degree of truth in that. If you really want to fully understand something in an evolutionary world, and that's what we're in, you're going to have a much fuller understanding of what it is by knowing its history and having some idea of how it came about. So that's what I was trying to give here, an account of at least a likely story from a Whiteheadian point of view. How you could have gone from primitive kind of chaos, where you had just got back into what Whitehead called chaos, just random events. I didn't actually go that far back. But then you get the emergence of things such as subatomic entities, and then out of those electrons and things at that level, and then atoms. So I was trying to give an account because, and showing that there's some reason why history and evolution are necessary, and therefore why hard artificial intelligence is a crazy program. To think that somehow we could jump directly from silicon molecules to conscious experience. Yeah.
In your paper, you say each actual occasion is an occasion of experience. Each occasion of experience, whether electronic, atomic, or human, begins by prehending prior events, which means taking aspects of them into itself. And then a few lines on down, finding the fact that past occasions and exerting causal influence on the present occasions are prehended into these. Is there any speculated mechanism for that happening?
I'm not sure what you mean by speculative mechanism.
How is this prehended into the actual occasion?
Oh, well, I think in any metaphysical view, you just have to take some things as this is the way things are. This is the ultimate nature of things.
So there's no speculated mechanism as of yet?
Well, even why should we assume that a mechanism is what we need? Mechanisms, one could argue, arise out of organisms, not the other way around. That in this view, Whitehead's own term for it was not process philosophy, it was the organismic worldview. And in Science of the Modern World, he called it organic mechanism. He put the two together, but he never used that again. So he called it the organic worldview, or the philosophy of organism. And then he showed how, whereas the materialist starts with mechanistic interactions and tries to ask them, okay, now how did living things and how did conscious things emerge out of those mechanisms? Whitehead says, we've been trying that for a long time and it hasn't worked. Why don't we try the opposite program and say organisms are fundamental, and then sometimes organisms get organized in such a way that they produce things that we call, that operate mechanistically. So this has been one of the biases of modern thought, is the idea that to explain anything, you've got to have a mechanism for it. So what Whitehead is suggesting here is that the ultimate nature of reality is that there are occasions of experience. And even back in the primordial chaos, you had occasions of experience. Now, they were not ordered in such a way that you could say, there goes that electron. There were no enduring objects, things that kept a stable form over time. But they had the capacity to organize into those. And so even at that level, you had entity, actual occasions that were prehending stuff from their path. The difference being that when you get an ordered entity like an electron, this present electronic event inherits primarily from the previous electronic event that we say was in that same society. It's influenced by the other events in the neighborhood too, but not to the same degree. So for the most part, it repeats the form of that. And this is just the way reality is. Reality is made up of prehending entities, prehending actual entities, and that's their very nature. And that's a direct appropriation. So take your own experience. If you accept this, for the sake of hypothesis, accept the view that your mind, your series of conscious experiences here that have consciousness, are prehending at each moment your various brain cells, so that the brain cells that are bringing visual stimuli from your eye, and likewise the ones from your ear and the ones from your hand, somehow you synthesize all of those into this unified experience. Because you're seeing things, you're hearing things, and you're touching things simultaneously. Let's just say you don't need a mechanism, then it has to be a mechanism between your mind and your brain cells. You just directly appropriate the data from the brain cells. So that's the basic model. But that's just the way reality is. And he suggests that metaphysics is an attempt to try to say, what is it about the world that is necessary? Not what has just contingently arisen in our particular universe that maybe started 14 billion years ago. So, and that's why I was remarking today on this book that's called Emergence of Everything, because I think that's nonsense. You can't talk about the emergence of everything as if certain basic metaphysical principles could emerge, or that something, the old thing, nothing can emerge out of nothing. There always has to be something. And the question is, basic metaphysical question, what is that basic something that has always existed, that is eternal, that just necessarily exists? And Whitehead says, occasions of experience. So it's a vast hypothesis, but so is every other worldview. A lot of them just don't recognize their hypothetical nature. Yeah.
Assuming that this synthetic process that you're talking about has always been, okay? Big Bang, there was a Big Bang.
Well, way before the Big Bang.
Okay, let's say that.
Forever.
According to Brian Greene today in the Times, the current cosmological view is that we're going to be very far.
Going to be what?
Great far. When there's energy to dissipate, that's going to be it. It's going to be background radiation. It's not long. But what happens to all that process then? That happens.
Oh, well, let's say here we're talking cosmology, and see in this work, a lot of people don't make a distinction between metaphysics and cosmology. So they assume that the beginning of our universe, if it were 14 some billion years ago, was just the beginning of stuff, beginning of everything. So I mean, they call it a singularity. So it's the beginning of time, it's the beginning of space, it's the beginning of finite actuality. Whitehead explicitly rejects that view. They were going back to the Platonic view that our world was created out of chaos, by bringing order out of chaos. By the way, that just happens to be the biblical worldview. The idea of creatio ex nihilo, if by nihilo you mean absolute nothingness. Not a biblical view at all. It arose at the end of the second Christian century. And it was good old Marcion, whose heresy stimulated the development of the canon. It turns out who also stimulated this, worst of all, Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, in my humble opinion. So Whitehead is returning to the Platonic view and to the biblical view, although Whitehead didn't know it was a biblical view. Very few people did at that time. And so it makes a distinction between the universe and our universe. So the universe, in the sense of a world of a multiplicity of finite actualities, and then as a panentheist, I would say a world of finite actuality, living within an all-inclusive divine reality. That's always been. But then these things come and go. So from that point of view, if it would turn out that Brian Greene was right, of course, Reg would think he's gravitational and Einstein, therefore probably not quite right. We won't say totally right. But let's say he turns out to be just right. The process is going to go on. So that's what process philosophy is. The processes are ultimate. They don't begin. Particular kinds of processes, so that our kind of gravitational forces, and electromagnetic entities, and these are all contingencies. But Whitehead's speculation is that there have always been actual occasions. There always will be. So that God will always be interacting with some realm of finitude, more or less complex, more or less interesting. Yes?
One or two more.
Philip has given me the choice of doing one or two more questions, so let's try one and see how it goes.
This one, this I think will be extremely short. I am always impressed by the subject-object distinction, and it seems I was having trouble with the concept of experiences at these lower levels, because it seems to, if you use the term experience, there always has to be an experiencer who is a subject of some sort, which is not explainable by causal theory or by the laws of physics. It's just irrelevant. And it seems like there's an attempt to want to bridge the subject-object concern here. Is this basically what I'm thinking of?
Yeah, so in this view, there is still subject-object experience, but it's different than generally Western thought has understood. So in the first place, in this thought, it isn't true that to have an experience, you first have to have an experiencer already existing. Rather, the actual entities come into existence. They are occasions of experience. So they are evoked into existence by the previous world plus the divine influence. And so you have new subjects arise. So each occasion of experience arises as a subject, prehending, perceiving previous objects. Objects is a relative term. An object is always an object for a subject. We've come to think of objects as mere objects in Cartesian sense, things that's just a piece of matter. But in the strict sense of object, an object is something that lies before a subject. And so take your present moment of experience and now remember what you were thinking just a moment ago. That moment of experience is now an object for your present subject. So Whitehead has an oscillating view that the universe oscillates continually between objects and subjects. These objects evoke new subjects into existence, and then these subjects complete their existence as a subject, and then immediately are objects for following subjects. So again, I could give the same answer I gave to the gentleman here. if somebody says, well, why? Well, that's just the nature of reality. And Whitehead would suggest, and Whitehead and Hartshorne would probably have suggested even stronger, that that's necessary, and that if we had the mind of God, if we were omniscient, we would see there couldn't be another kind of universe. That this is the way, the one and only way that reality can be. So it sounds like that was the one question that took plenty of time. So,
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David.
Because frankly, as I was going through it, this is a really difficult lecture. I'm glad I'm not out there listening to it. And I'm very amazed that you all stayed there. So thank you.